And a fascinating report on the front of the Telegraph today. And this is a new report published by the Institute of Economic Affairs, a report by scientists from Johns Hopkins University and Lund University looking at almost 20,000 different studies on measures taken to protect populations against COVID across the world. Looked at all the different lockdown measures, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the NPIs that were carried out, whether it's masks, whether it's closing schools, closing businesses, travel bans, track and trace, you name it. They looked at every single one. And guess what they concluded? I know this is going to blow your minds. That, certainly when it comes to the UK, the very first lockdown from March 2020 till about early July 2020, on the basis of modelling that predicted that, well, there could have been more than 500,000 deaths. So many lives were saved. It was worth it. Well, according to these scientists, just 1,700 lives in England and Wales were saved in the spring of 2020. But that the costs of that policy were absolutely huge. They were staggering collateral costs, they say. Those savings of lives were just a drop in the bucket. Well, let's talk to one of the co-authors of that report from the Centre for Political Studies in Denmark, Jonas Herby. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Really appreciate you joining us. I've campaigned a long time against lockdowns, but I was interested to see in your biography that you came at this from a very similar attitude that I did, which was that when we did lock down, I thought, yeah, that was the right thing to do. And then as the data emerged and as the evidence emerged of the harms, but also of the lack of benefit, started questioning those decisions. And that's the same kind of view you had as well. Tell us how this study worked and how you were able to come to this conclusion that as few as 1,700 lives were saved.
Yeah, I think we all remember that the first studies on lockdowns showed that it would save a lot of lives. But basically, those studies didn't take into account that people also want to survive. So they respond, even no matter what the government says, people will respond to a pandemic by canceling birthday parties and working from home if possible, and so on. So what the government does is only in top of that, what people do voluntarily. And that's the main difference with the studies in our meta-study is that they use a method that can account for voluntary behaviour changes. And when we do that, we can see that the effect of the government's lockdown was very limited.
And this is where we go back to the data from March 2020 in this country. And this is something that's still disputed, but the data is there clear in black and white in terms of the number of infections and the number of cases, that actually the number of infections had already peaked in the UK before we locked down because people were taking measures. I was taking measures. I was advising my parents, you shouldn't be going. I remember we advised my father, who was in his late 70s, don't go to my brother's 40th birthday party, where 7 of us, by the way, caught COVID, because, he was at risk and we weren't. And this is what people were doing already, social distancing, washing their hands and being extra careful. And you're saying basically the sort of measures that country like Sweden, alone in Europe, instigated, that actually, advice, a few measures to deal with, big crowds of people and things like that. Actually, that was all that was needed. And we would have dealt with this with pretty much the same number of deaths, but without all of the harms.
Yeah, that's more or less what the data shows. And I think the key role here is that information matters. So when we get information about the progress of the pandemic, we respond to the pandemic, and the population respond by canceling birthday parties or working from home. But politicians, they respond by locking down the country. But it turns out that the most effective thing is people responding voluntarily. And I think one part of that is because how you get infected is very complicated. Mm-hmm. So you can meet with other people, both safely and unsafe. But that if you go to work, for instance, it's very difficult for the government to regulate how you behave at work. You have to trust the citizen. And I think that's basically what the studies that we study show. But
also the different risks that people had. We were all told we were all at risk. Everyone was going to die. I still see people every single day, people in their 20s, slim, healthy people. I talk to them. They say no underlying health risk. They're wearing masks. They're still terrified of getting COVID. And you just think, this is crazy. You weren't terrified of getting flu, and yet you're terrified of getting COVID, even though you're double, triple jabbed, and the fear that was engendered in people when actually we did know as early as February 2020. A lot of people say, well, we know now it was older people. We knew early 2020 that this was a disease that affected largely older people. The most people, if you look at a graph of a bar chart or a pie chart of how many people died, 2/3 of those people will be in their 80s and 90s. And people were absolutely convinced that their children were going to die. And again, virtually zero children who did not have, I mean, awful that any child should die of anything, and we understand that, but didn't have comorbidities died. So an awful lot of this was brought about because we were all told that we were all at risk, and that simply wasn't the case.
No, the disease was much more dangerous for old people than for young people. But I think people, I mean, in the beginning of the pandemic, people have to respond as they find proper for themselves, because we're all different, and some are more scared than other people. And I think in the beginning of a pandemic, it makes sense to be a little extra careful, because who knows what kind of long COVID it will entail and so on. But it's when you don't know if lockdowns work and you don't know the specific risk of each person, then maybe it's better just to leave it up to the individual.
And this is the key thing, isn't it? Because World Health Organization advice and indeed established pandemic planning in pretty much every country was that you didn't lock down. And people often talk about, say, Sweden as this outlier that went down this outrageously different route. On the contrary, they were the ones that stuck to pre-pandemic or pre-COVID pandemic planning. And the reason why no country had locked down before was because it was established that there would be huge costs involved, and they simply weren't taken into account. So when they were talking about saving X number of lives, and we had this computer model from Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, I'm sure you've read about, which was out by an absurd scale. He's claimed 500,000 deaths could happen if we didn't take any measures. But again, completely ignoring A, how many of the community were not at risk, B, how many voluntary measures people were taking, but also the extra cost of lockdowns, children losing out in education, mental health, physical health, the cost to the economy, the damage to the NHS, all of those knock-on effects. We're never going to have a daily press conference about all those deaths, are we?
No, it was. I think it was. What was it? Woolhouse who wrote the book that When the World Went Mad, where he's. And I think he has a point, because everybody focused at one disease, and that's not the way we usually run healthcare. We try to make balances, and I think we much in large failed to do that during the pandemic. At least the early part of the pandemic.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the only way we were able to prove that computer modelling was, frankly, a load of bunkum was actually when all the health specialists and experts in this country were calling for a lockdown in December 2021, and the cabinet basically refused, and we didn't have a lockdown. And what a surprise, we didn't see a huge increase in deaths when we had Omicron, even though, I mean, again, the evidence from South Africa was clear it was not such a big risk. Do you think that we have learnt the lessons of COVID, of pandemic planning, of lockdowns? Because we've got a COVID inquiry going on in this country. Some other countries have already completed theirs. Ours is not even getting going until, I think, later this week, next week. It is set to run for years and years to come. Do you think the right lessons have been learned?
I think we're still working on it, to be honest. And I think it's very difficult for... Imagine that you were the one to make the decisions back then, and everybody was scared, and everybody basically wanted you to lock down the country.
Yeah.
So how do you handle that now? Will you go on and say that I make a huge mistake, or will you try to just kick the can down the road and hope that things will kind of solve themselves in the long run? So I think it's a very difficult political problem, because. Yep. If you go out and say that it was a major mistake and I caused all these costs to the children, especially the vulnerable children, then voters will probably punish you.
Yeah,
even though
that's the thing.
It might not even be fair because everybody wanted you to lock down at that point.
Yeah.
So
I
I
mean,
think
the government, the politicians were responding to public demand. But that said, the public demand came about because we had propaganda basically telling us we should all be terrified. So it was kind of self-fulfilling, wasn't it? I mean, we've currently got this inquiry starting. If you were running the inquiry into the handling of the pandemic, what's the key question that the inquiry chair should be asking of the government, the scientists, whoever help make the decisions? What's the key question they should be asking? What's the evidence they should be looking for?
The basic question is whether the cost compared to the benefits. And our study shows that the benefits was probably pretty small compared to the costs.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we can always get smarter on this topic. And of course, our estimate will change in the future because we get new research. But I think in the end, it will still remain that the lockdowns were fairly ineffective and the costs were extremely large. And this is probably not the road that we should seek in another pandemic.
Yeah, and that's the key thing.
We just give people information and then rely on their own behaviour.
Indeed, and that's the key thing, isn't it? Because it's not just, it's in the past. There will be another pandemic and there will be more demands for lockdowns. And we need to know that we've learnt the right lessons so that we don't make the same mistakes again. Jonas Herby, I so appreciate you joining us. It's a fantastic piece of work. He's co-author of this new study. He's from the Centre for Political Studies in Denmark. Thank you. Quick word from James Heal on this. I mean, this is what we were asking for, and Tory MPs and the COVID group that were desperately trying to get some sense on this. Cost-benefit analysis. There was no cost-benefit analysis. Yes, you might save some lives, as it turns out, according to this study. Far fewer. I mean, you basically, 1 day of deaths was saved. That's all that was. And I'm sorry for those people, but realistically, that was not worth ruining a generation's education, ruining our health system, ruining our economy for decades to come, mental health, physical health. It wasn't worth it. Do you think those lessons are going to be learned?
Well, I'm very sceptical, unfortunately, and I think that everything I've seen of the COVID inquiry thus far would suggest that actually it's going to be listening to a certain view, which is, why didn't we lock down sooner? So talking to the victims' families, obviously, which is tragic, but also you need to make sure you have countervailing evidence to ensure that when we do have that next pandemic, we make the right strategic choices. And I'd be less concerned about things such as Boris Johnson, etc., and individuals involved necessarily than the structures in place. Things like SAGE, what was going into their thinking, how were they trying to influence policy, and those, I think, are the key strategic questions and much more of use. And I think that, as sort of a limited specific inquiry looking at certain issues rather than the kind of farce that we've got so far, where it's much more about kicking the can down the road, would probably be much more help to everyone.